Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
So a story on TikTok is on my mind. And so it turns out TikTok is not very healthy for young people to consume in high amounts, which is exactly what they're doing. So before we throw out...
Okay, we're just if you hear me giggling, it's because we know this, Cameron. I mean, so there's data for this now, but if there's ever we knew this and we told ourselves so. Anyhow, carry on.
Well, and that's part of why reading some of these pieces is slightly, amusing is kind of a harsh word. There's a sardonic facial expression I'm making as I'm going through these headlines, because I'd asked you, Nathan, we were talking about the story in the first place. When you first heard murmurings of TikTok, the social media platform, and how it worked, what was your, immediate knee-jerk reaction to it? Did you think, oh, yeah, well, that's probably going to be a relatively innocuous and harmless app that my children can spend some time on? So now there are some astonishing figures that have emerged. I think the one that caught both Nathan and I was that it takes, they've studied it, 35 minutes for you to get addicted to TikTok. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And I think it's really incredible. That is an accomplishment, for better or for worse. And so, I mean, what the documents...
twisted use of the phrase, yes.
Yes. I mean, and so the internal documents that are being exposed, that are being leaked with redacted portions and all that, are saying things that I think are going to be pretty obvious at this point. All of this is by design. The people who are in positions of leadership have deliberately engineered this app to be as addicting as possible. And guess what? They don't care if they're dealing with minors. There's specific proof that internal memos that basically state, unless someone explicitly declares themselves to be 13 or a minor, don't bother investigating or, putting, any kind of restraint there. Don't worry about that. So, and of course, leadership of, everybody's trained in PR speak. They're, those quotes are being taken out of context and they're being wildly misrepresented and blah, blah, blah. So this caught our eye because this is I didn't realize, Nathan, actually, that, and this shows perhaps that sometimes you and I are a little bit cloistered. I didn't realize just how wildly popular TikTok is, though, and how many, I think it was something like 160 million people in the U.S. are using it. So these are astonishing figures.
So we're looking at half of the U.S. population, 95% of people under 17 use it. I mean,
that blew my mind.
It's large numbers, but then if you look at the statistical concentration of who's really, really using it for, an average, 108 minutes a day, I think 107 minutes a day.
Yep.
That's incredible. You're pushing, hour and a half numbers there, over an hour and a half a day usage. So even if you were to say, okay, we're just sucking mind capital out of, a formative part of our lives, it's interesting because, the old controversy around TikTok was that it was a Chinese-owned company and it was harvesting your data and had connection to other apps and resources on your phone. And everybody's like, but it's fun. So there's that whole bit of TikTok, which, is you get what you pay for here. And in this case, if it's free, you're the thing that's being paid for. But then, in the more recent links that NPR is exposing right now out of some of these internal investigations is saying that you have the monetization of the sexualized content of minors is a fairly significant thing here when you have, 15-year-old strippers and that kind of thing who are receiving tokens that are then cashable for actual money from who knows who watching online, that you have some deeper ethical issues at play involved in all this. So whether or not you want to look at foreign ownership, data harvesting, the amount of time that young people are doing it, and then you look at the algorithms that are clearly boosting carefully scripted concepts of beauty and what type of things that, want to be pushed and boosted and for people to see. So there's a very narrowly defined concept of beauty that the algorithm uses, which you could think about the mental health of that for young women in particular. Like, there's just nothing about this to me that, so when you say we're kind of cloistered, it's in some categories, but I know enough about, like, I'm not cloistered enough from human nature that I know when something is a bad idea for humans. So there's kind of this catch-20, like, there's this odd thing there of like, yeah, I don't wake up in the morning and poke myself in the eyeball with a fork. But it's not because I'm cloistered. It's just because I'm like, this is a bad idea. So for, I think, people like us, that's a challenge there. And so
Wait.
and I don't want to talk about technology here, but go ahead.
Before we get there, though, because of what you said, I want to ask you something, Nathan. And I think you'll understand why I'm going here. So Mark Knoll has said in many different places, he said this in interviews, he's also said this in print, that evangelicals in the United States, modern evangelicals we're notable for being activists. We're all about getting stuff done, mobilizing people for a cause. And it's one of our great strengths, and it's one of our great weaknesses because we tend to rush headlong into things. What you're saying about TikTok seems to suggest that it has little to no redemptive qualities about it whatsoever. Yet I remember, Nathan, when you and I worked for a major Christian evangelical organization, I remember when TikTok was on the scene, there was a lot of lively conversation about how, no, but this is where the people are at. So we need to meet people where they're at. And TikTok is a really helpful platform. We need Christians on TikTok. We need Christians redeeming TikTok. I'll respond to that too at some point, but I want to hear you talk a little bit about that because I think that would be really helpful. And we know people who are using.
I'm trying to think if there's anything.
Some of our old colleagues are using TikTok, by the way, in this very way. And there are certain apologists who are on TikTok, and they're using that as a means of doing ministry. So let's try to talk seriously about that for a little bit, because I think that's worth exploring.
I had
so many wheels are turning right now.
I had a great grandfather. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So think of it like this. I had a great grandfather who never went to preach a revival unless it was at least 2 weeks long.
Mm-hmm.
Because he felt like he needed to preach for 14 days straight to say what he believed to be true about the gospel. And for that he said, you have 1 week to revive the church and then 1 week to reach the community. That's a half a month of like intensive preaching in order to communicate ideas in a deep enough way that it would actually impact people's lives. Now, that might be an extreme on one direction, but the extreme in the other direction is to say that you could say something transformative and meaningful and discipleship forming in less than 30 seconds that's stacked in the deck in between 130 other videos of people popping balloons and whatever else and weird dances. To me, the media, the message just doesn't fit in the medium. So maybe this is my lack of imagination of knowing how to do it well. And maybe we do have friends and former colleagues and stuff who are doing this. I think you can use social media to point to actual content and events, but for it to be the actual content, I'm becoming increasingly skeptical of it being a meaningful platform for deep, long-lasting change and character formation.
Would you say that?
But at this juncture of my thinking, that's where I'm at.
No, and I appreciate that provisional tone there. But at this point, would you say that with TikTok, it's really just a difference of degree and not kind? Because I'm also wondering, a platform like X, formerly Twitter, you're similarly limited by the format there. Obviously, it's a little bit more brief. But even something like Facebook these days, which, I mean, all social media, I'm trying to formulate a good question here. Have you seen a good example, Nathan, just in your own experience, of somebody using any social media platform in a vibrant way for ministry. Because I'm not just thinking about TikTok anymore. I think I'm kind of expanding it a bit because, yeah.
Well,
and you can turn it around on me too.
Justify thinking out loud's. Yeah. Well, I was like, what were we about to do here is justify thinking out loud's pathetic social media engagement and digital reach.
There you go.
Yeah. So here we go. All right. I got to go in a full circle here. So I'm going to start going one direction and then come back around to where.
Mm-hmm.
So here's how it is, Cameron. I think largely, I feel like I've outgrown, just personally and for my family, I've outgrown social media being a source of fascination for me.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I don't like the people that I know and who are a deep part of my life are people that I don't even text. Because I see them, I call them on the phone, I'm with them multiple days a year, at least, multiple times a week for a lot of them. And so the digital interaction is just seemingly increasingly dusty and tasteless in my mouth. So let me just put that there. And I recognize that I have the privilege of saying that because I do have really rich, thick, and deep community and people in physical proximity to me, and I'm situated in the world and in a community in such a way that that's a possibility for me. So I will concede that is perhaps rare in our time, although I don't want to give up on that as a vision that I hope other people also have in their lives. So let's see social media. I think I kind of see it like bottled water. It's kind of ridiculous that it has to exist. But if you're thirsty, bottled water will do. But it's different than drinking out of, a mountain spring or your well. And because it's artificially produced, it's packaged, it's shipped long distance, and it has, no local characteristics or qualities to it. And you're probably overpaying for it. So, yeah, if you're dying of thirst, bottled water is great. That's a shame if that's what you have to live on. I think if you're starving for human connections, then social media is a surrogate for that. But let's not act as if it's the ideal. And I think, like even your Sherry Turkle types would say, it's not just what you're not learning or not doing. It is kind of, it's not just what you're doing on social media. It's what you're not doing in real life when you're using an hour and a half of your day to scroll through 42-second videos. So I see red flags and yellow lights of caution all over the place on the whole thing in general. Now, that being said, I think I do have to step back and recognize that my upbringing, my theology, my perception, my personality are all hardwired against naturally thinking that these things are. I log on to Facebook once a year to say thank you to all the people who left me happy birthday messages. Maybe I do it every other year. Like, it just is not one of those things that gets me up in the morning at all. It's not even on my radar of something that's exciting to me. So that being said, I do recognize that for a lot of people, that's where the people are. But your dad talks about the idea of interest, of interest, concern, and focus. So if you draw a great big circle and say, this is your area of interest, and then inside that circle, you have another circle, and that's your area of concern. And then inside that area, you have an area of focus. For me, social media is like out there in that outer interest category. These are people that I don't know, that I'll never run into in real life, probably, who have ideas that I may or may not disagree with. It just seems so remote and distant. And I have so much to do within my area of focus that it falls to the periphery fairly easily for me. So that being said, that's just me. There are other people who what's a tangential, like and far out peripheral version of interest for me is an area of focus for them. And what I'm doing and where I'm focused on in my life is like out in the peripheral, just distant area of interest for them. So I think we don't want to pigeonhole anybody here or any other form of impactful ministry. But I think for me and what I'm working on and the level at which I want to engage with ideas and other people and try to live out my Christian faith and growing discipleship in a robust, physical, tangible way, it's hard for me to get excited about that. I'm glad if there are other people who are doing that and that is producing meaningful fruit. But I also know that viewer numbers, et cetera, and all those other, cool statistics don't necessarily result in meaningful change either. You can have a lot of big numbers that stack up pretty quickly, but what the actual conversion or return on that investment of that time is, who knows? So that was a big, long, blabbling circle of saying where I'm coming from, but then also maybe I'm not a 16-year-old girl, so what do I know?
Well, I do keep putting you on the spot. One thing that I think is revealing is I don't ever hear anybody say, you know what, I need some more social media usage in my life. I'm trying to get that number up in the next year. There's widespread recognition that less would be better for everybody. So I think that's revealing. And it strikes me that the conversation surrounding social media is somewhat similar to the conversation of previous years surrounding television. Now, social media is markedly different in many ways, but there was a lot of conversation about how television is so addicting. It's deadening attention spans. And also, when you had multiple channels, you could never settle on one thing. You just kept flipping through the channels. And I mean, it was a similar. Now, the difference here is this is interactive and it's even more addictive. But I remember some of the better commentary I thought on.
But TV isn't personalized to you, where social media gets what you like and then just starts throwing you everything. Yeah. So TV is it's broadly stereotyping and categorizing for attention, but social media takes that to a whole nother level.
Oh, yeah. So it's much more addicting and it curates everything for your experience. But I thought one of the helpful voices on that was David Foster Wallace, because he wrote so amusingly about it in some ways and captured how incredibly seductive it was. And notably, at the end of his life, he never owned a television because he just basically said, I'm not strong enough to do that. But all that to say, there's widespread recognition that social media is not great. But I can hear people saying, all right, yeah, it's not great, but it's where the people are. You used that phrase yourself, Nathan. But you also talked about how massive numbers don't necessarily result in deep change. Another way I would like to put that is a helpful distinction to bear in mind when we talk about any of these different tools, these different cultural tools that emerge, is that just because something works doesn't necessarily mean we ought to do it. Now, this is something Nathan and I often suggest to you. So put this in your pipe and smoke it. Think about it. We don't want to tell you how to think or what to think, but I will give you an example here, a specific example. So one of the things that I've seen done effectively, I don't think it's necessary, as you'll see, I don't think this is necessarily good. It's been done effectively so there's a proliferation of reaction videos on various social media platforms where you'll see somebody giving one of their monologues or something like that, and then the other person is just sitting there making faces, and then they'll pause the video to offer a critique. So I've seen a couple of Christian apologists do this very effectively, by the way, where somebody will be talking about how
actually that is a good category.
Right. So Easter is pagan, for instance. You hear every year when we hit certain moments on the calendar, certain items will resurface again and again and again. And so this one, somebody's talking about how Easter is really a pagan holiday, blah, blah, blah. And this apologist is frowning, making the funny faces, and then pauses. All right, let me just go ahead and set this straight here. And then starts to give you some very helpful information. So it's effective in the sense that this gets a lot of views. And I think a few of these videos have gone viral. My question is, what are they actually achieving? What are they actually accomplishing? If you're in certain, and this is a way of thinking that my dad kind of has instilled in me over the years, if you go into certain areas where the very way, I mean, Nathan said it well with the, quoting Marshall McLuhan with the medium as the message, but if something is framed in a certain way, you may already be on the wrong footing. And in social media, the whole way that this is set up, the whole context of social media, I do think, and this is just take it with a grain of salt, but I do think the whole context, the whole vibe, if you will, of social media militates against serious, careful consideration. The people who are watching a video like that, a reaction video, almost certainly most of them will already share the conclusion of the person who's making the video. Now, that's not necessarily bad, by the way. Let's just understand what it's actually accomplishing, because we all need our beliefs reinforced. We all need encouragement, and we all need robust arguments to help us out. Austin Farrer, who was an associate, a friend of C.S. Lewis's, but wrote, and he was an Anglican priest, but he had a great quote on apologetics, which is not going to come to mind right now, but basically talked about how apologetics engenders an atmosphere and an environment where faith can thrive. And I agree. So, but the notion that this kind of stuff is really doing outreach work, I think, is misguided. I don't think it is. And I think also there's a chance that it is sandwiched in between the video of the provocative girl and the person with the balloon. And because of that, the tendency of it to, the likelihood of somebody really taking the information to heart and gleaning some real wisdom from it is very slim. I think that's highly unlikely. So I don't know if I helped anything there. I just wanted to bring in that distinction of just because something's effective and it works doesn't necessarily mean it's really what we want to be doing. If we're after lasting change, I think social media is a poor tool.
Let's try to figure out, though, if we are like Luddites and we're way behind on this, or if we're way ahead on this, because both of those could be true. So we're looking at it and we're like, we're not buying what was being sold here. And you could look at and say, okay, you guys are showing your age that you're not interested in this. You got to get with the system. This is the future. I'm more willing to bet that my skepticism toward it and the desire for actual physical community is the way of the future, and what more people are going to be craving when it comes to just life in general, much less church and discipleship. And to justify that, let me point out that Cameron and I grew up right in the middle of the proliferation of the internet, Facebook. Like we've lived in the, and so it's almost like we've visited that country and rejected it. It's not that we don't understand it or that we don't. So there's a sense in which it's not that I don't know what I'm talking about here. It's not that you don't know what you're talking about here. It's that we feel like we really, really, really know what we're talking about here, and saying, yeah, but this isn't it. So I'm saying that, I think, in order to justify my skepticism here, is that it's these statements that I'm saying that sound countercultural and counterintuitive here are not based out of ignorance. It's based out of experience and then rejection. And to me, that's different than just, the kids these days. Now, flip side of that. So like my 87-year-old grandmother loves Facebook. It lets her see pictures of her great grandkids all over the place, and she's not as mobile as she once was. And so that's a fun way where she can see them blowing bubbles in the driveway from, 187 miles away. Great. There's room for that, but that's not the phase of the life that I'm in, and it's not what I'm trying to do. And so I don't want to sound like, trash the whole thing. Not that, but at the same time, I don't know why. Maybe somebody can help me figure out why it's not enthralling to me. Here's the other thing. Have you ever, okay, YouTube is basically social media now. Have you ever sat down and gone and scrolled through a bunch of YouTube videos, just not because you're looking for something, but just because you were, and then at the end of that, say you do that for an hour, and then you say, I learned something really valuable here, and I feel better about myself in the world.
Right.
I mean, you laugh in response to that question. So
sure.
Even if there wasn't like the whole philosophical, cognitive, theological framework for my conception of human interactions, just out of a personal experience of personal well-being, it's like eating like a pound of Velveeta cheese.
Right.
You're like, there's nothing good about that. It was fun while it lasted, but
I mean, the analogy of junk food, I think, is really apt. That comes up over and over again, because junk food is so easy. It goes down so well, it tastes great, but it leaves you feeling so lousy. So the long-term effects really are not great. And the same here. This all seems to be in a general category of junk food. But something I wanted to rattle off some facts that would seem to confirm what Nathan said about us, which admittedly, is a little bit self-justifying, because we don't want to just be seen as, Luddites who are reactionary and also old and crotchety. But if you look at the growing trend of digital fasts and digital holidays and resorts, the reason this is cutting edge is because a lot of this is geared toward very wealthy people, and this is irony of ironies, influencers who they'll go to these very expensive exclusive resorts where you turn your phone in and you have limited to no internet, and then they can come back and extol the virtues of being online less, while having a carefully curated platform with with an image and all of that, basically reinforcing all of the worst aspects of the online world, but themselves enjoying more and more of a fast from it. Or if you look at the habits of people who are major players in Silicon Valley, even if look at their children go to schools with limited to no internet, where they can't have smartphones. Some of them withhold this technology from their children, all of which tells you that this stuff is, the people who work in this stuff most deeply know how harmful it is, but also that there's a growing awareness that to get away from it will lead to a better, healthier, happier life. So we're not even talking about any kind of philosophical arguments here. These aren't arguments for the spiritual benefits of abstaining. This is just the most basic recognition that, wow, this stuff is really leading to a whole lot of turmoil and unhappiness in people's lives, and addiction and loss of focus, loss of empathy and all this stuff. So maybe we should do it less. So I guess,
there's a lot of stuff like that. Like I believe that 2 + 2 = 4, not because I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, it fits within my Christian belief, but that's not and so the same thing on, I think, a lot of the sociological and psychological impacts of this. It's not like this is a great fundamentalist Christian conspiracy here, down with the system. It's just, this is where all the arrows are pointing. I think it's easy to pick Cameron on young people. Some of you will remember that, a couple months ago, I did an interview with my grandpa, talking about the 60s. And it was funny when I went to do that. I said, "Hey, can you record today?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Yeah, that'll work." And he said, I'm just finishing a week-long internet fast. Here's a 92-year-old. I was like, "What's up with that?" And he's like, I intermittently do a 1-week fast from using the internet, just to make sure that I'm using it and it's not using me. I thought that's pretty interesting. Yeah. So here's somebody who's 92 years old, who's thinking about, what is this doing to my attention span? What is it doing? Like, who's really what and who is using whom here? And what, there's some wisdom in that. So I think, for the rest of our lives, we'll be working this one out. Can I, here, as we bring this to a close, Cameron, switch directions and say something about parenting and technology? Because Please. A lot of the stuff, when I look at this, I think, actually, is this a problem with technology? Sure. But is this an issue with parenting? Now, my oldest child my kids are between 11 and 5 right now. So on the younger end of this, I can't envision a world in which my kids get a smartphone until they're 47. Same. No, 18. Yeah, I just 47. Can't
I like
figure
that
out.
one.
And I think, when I look around at my peers and friend group, I think most of us are in that same boat of saying, it's not going to. In fact, who's telling me? I think one of my brothers talking about studies in China of where you hear like the whole like Glow Kid thing. You're in the restaurant and you see the kid on an iPad. That you actually have like visual issues happening in some parts of the world where kids don't have a long distance, can't focus on objects at long distances because they never look up and out a window at a long distance. That's actually a prescription some places now for children to develop eyesight, like sit and look at a tree in the distance. I mean, it's just sad when you start looking at that level of, but it's the flip side of that is people say, hey, that's a certain amount of privilege that you have that you can parent in a way in which you don't have to just park a kid in the corner for 3 hours and say, hey, do this while I go to work, or I take care of this, or I myself am on my devices. So it's an incredibly hard thing to do. But I think investing time in our children so that some of these things aren't as attractive is worth doing. I got thinking about technology and parenting from a really, really old story. And so let me throw this in here as food for thought. So we act as if this whole technology thing is a new question, but I got my handy copy of Metamorphosis here by Ovid, who, by the way, died in the year 17. So that was a little while ago for those of you doing the math on this. And the famous story of Daedalus and Icarus, summarize it just quickly. Most all of you will know this. So Daedalus and his son get confined on Crete because of the whole episode with the Minotaur and all of that. Daedalus is, an inventor. He's confined and imprisoned on Crete, and he decides he's going to escape. Of course, the land and the sea are blocked by his captors. So he said, we're going to fly out of here, basically. And he looks at a bird wing, figures out how to, build synthetic bird wings. And so he builds wings for himself out of wax and bird feathers. And he gives this really interesting, so this is in book 8 of Ovid's version of this. And what he says is when he gives the new technology, he's giving the new wings to his son. He says, I warn you, Icarus, fly a middle course. Don't go too low or the water will weigh the wings down. Don't go too high or the sun's fire will burn them. Keep to the middle way. And one more thing, no fancy steering by constellation or star. Follow my lead. That was the flying lesson. And now he fit to the wings, to the boy's shoulders. And between work and warning, the father found his cheeks were wet with tears and his hands trembled. He kissed his son goodbye if he had known it. And what I think is interesting about this rendition is that you see Daedalus crying as he gives his son a new technology and a new device because he recognizes the dangers inherent in the gift. And so he's giving him a gift that is intended for his freedom, that he knows can lead to his downfall and his destruction. And so he's crying at the gift. And I at one point started writing something and never got it really pulled together in a way that I liked it, called Did You Cry When You Gave Your Kid a Phone? Because I think there's that, do you recognize the danger here? I forget who was I listening to who said, if you're not willing to drop your kid off in the middle of Times Square for a couple hours, why in the world would you give them, a smartphone? Or somebody else said, we give our smart devices to our kids thinking that it grants them access to the world, but really we're granting the world access to our child. I think that's the right thinking, to recognize the danger there. And so at this point, and everybody will have to decide for themselves and then for the children and the other young people and young adults around them, is the freedom of the gift worth the dangers? And is the person psychologically and sociologically mature enough to handle it in a way in which they will use their freedom, or they'll use the device or the technology to gain freedom, or will it end up killing them? And so in the story of Icarus, that's exactly what happens. He flies too high. The sun melts the wings. He thinks this is wonderful. He's soaring. And then all of a sudden it's gone and he crashes and he dies in the ocean. And then Daedalus, his father, flies over and saw the wings on the waves and cursed his talents. And so that is a story that we talk about as hubris of, I've always heard that, high school literature, whatever, of it's about hubris, it's about flying too high. It's a story about technology and recognition of the dangers. And one of the interesting parts in there is that he specifically tells Icarus, the only way this is going to work is if you follow my lead. And so I wonder what technology use patterns am I modeling for my kids? If they follow my lead, is that a middle flight plan? Is that a middle course? And so for me, all of this leads back to a sense of deep introspection on my behalf of saying, am I using technology in such a way that I'm modeling good usage for the people that I'm actively trying to disciple, that they will be able to receive the gift of technology in a way that brings freedom rather than destruction. And I can't work that out for everybody listening to this, just to throw that out there as a thought experiment for each of us to work through and to wrestle with, and to realize that we're talking about something well over 2,000 years old here. But again, this is the value of understanding human nature. It doesn't matter if it's TikTok, like 5 years from now, it'll be a whole different set of apps. So you have to think about the principles here, not the manifestations of the marketing skills or the technology. It's about, what do we know to be true about human nature? And then can we be realistic enough about that to understand the deep, complex principles of what it is that we're created to do in relationship with God and with each other, and then make decisions based on that. So I submit to you, if you want to go back and read the story of Icarus again, and think of it in terms of technology rather than hubris. Of course, those are, joined at the hip here, but little food for thought for those of you who are listening along, and I'll let Cameron decide whether or not that's a constructive angle to approach this from.
Absolutely not. I can't believe you brought that in here, Nathan. No, that's a very timely meditation on that myth, which sometimes overfamiliarity does indeed breed contempt. And I think given what you've said, people do have a little bit of a superficial read on that. But definitely, I keep, cursed his talents is a haunting phrase too.
Mm-hmm.
Because that has a bearing on a lot of what we've said here as well. Just because, and that's kind of I think of Jurassic Park puts this kind of explicitly. Just because we could doesn't mean we, did it mean we should? And I think in America we are predisposed, most of us, because we're kind of natural born pragmatists, to ask first, does this work, rather than is this right? And I think that doesn't rule out all social media usage, by the way. Nothing of what we've said has ruled out all social media usage. What we're trying to do is just get the wheels turning on reconsidering not just the tool itself, but also asking questions. How does this affect me personally? And if you have children, asking that first too. Not just how will this affect my kids, but how is this affecting me? I use social media sometimes. How does that affect me? I have a smartphone. Most of you listening, if you have children, most of you already have smartphones. How are you doing with the smartphone? And then when you think about that honestly, how do you feel about putting that into the small hands of your children? So I think, this is just an occasion for deep reflection on what it is we're getting up to in our day-to-day lives. There are so many things that we can simply just drift into. And this is true of any cultural moment. There's always a whole constellation of habits you can just simply drift into if you just go with the flow. But as Christians, we don't ever want to just go with the flow, because the status quo, biblically speaking, is called the world. And the world there doesn't refer to the created order, which is good, that God made. The world refers to the institutions made by human beings, which have a lot of ingenuity, but are also fallen and corrupt. There's a lot of brokenness there. So we don't want to just go with the flow. This is why it's important as Christian people, we have our own culture. It doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to the questions around us. I still like Karl Barth's image that he gives to you of the pastor with the Bible in his one hand and the newspaper in the other. And I think that's a good picture. But we need a balance there, and we need to be drawing on our own resources. And our resources will be Christ, his word, and his people. And if those are our sources of nourishment, then we'll have all that we need to engage these platforms or to disengage from them, and to do so well, and not in a legalistic sense, but really in a way that in which we're following the path of wisdom, I think. So the hope here, as always, is just to get the wheels turning. And to that end, we hope we've done a little bit of that for you. And in case you missed it, in all of this commotion, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.